A trade war doesn't usually shift in a single morning. It normally unfolds slowly through statements, counterstatements, tariff adjustments, and policy reactions that markets gradually learn to price in. But this time, something broke that rhythm entirely. Instead of a predictable cycle of escalation and response, the situation snapped into a new phase almost overnight. When Donald Trump escalated pressure on Canada, it wasn't just another adjustment in trade policy. It was a direct test of assumptions that global markets had been relying on for years. In Washington's view, stability in the system meant control over the outcome, that sustained pressure would eventually force alignment. That belief held for a long time until Canada responded in a way that financial models simply hadn't accounted for. By the time investors and analysts realized something fundamental had shifted, the first wave of change had already moved through the system. It began with what initially looked like a routine escalation. The United States increased pressure, tightened its trade demands, and presented them as final conditions in ongoing negotiations. On the surface, it resembled the familiar approach. Apply enough pressure, force a reaction, and bring the other side back to the table on stronger terms. But markets don't react to intentions. They react to structure, and this time, the structure had changed in a way few expected. Canada didn't respond inside the usual cycle. It didn't immediately mirror tariffs or issue rapid political retaliation. Instead, Ottawa, under Mark Carney's leadership, reacted to the assumption behind Washington's strategy that Canada would behave predictably, absorb pressure, and return to negotiations in the same familiar pattern. That pattern is exactly what markets were priced for. Tariffs would trigger counter-tariffs. Political pressure would lead to talks. Talks would drag on until a compromise emerged. That loop had defined Canada-US trade disputes for years, and financial systems had built their expectations around it. But this time, Canada stepped outside that loop. At first, nothing obvious happened. No dramatic announcement, no immediate countermeasure, no visible escalation that would signal a breaking point. For a short window, even experienced analysts assumed it was just another familiar phase in a long-gunning dispute. Then the first signals began appearing, not in political headlines, but in financial behavior. Bond markets moved in ways that didn't align with broader economic data. Currency desks noticed coordinated shifts that didn't match any clear policy announcement. Equity flows began showing pressure across multiple sectors without a single defining news trigger, and that absence of explanation itself became the first warning sign. Because in markets, when movement comes before the story, it usually means the story hasn't been fully seen yet. Behind the scenes, something larger was already taking shape. What Wall Street didn't immediately understand was that what they were seeing was only the first layer of something much larger. Canada's response wasn't designed as a single visible move. It was structured to unfold gradually, step by step, across different parts of the financial system. From the outside, investors thought they were watching a standard escalation in a trade dispute. But in reality, they were already inside the response without realizing it. And that's what made it so difficult to interpret in real time. Markets don't panic when something happens. They panic when they realize something has been happening for longer than they thought. By the time traders began to understand that Canada's actions weren't isolated reactions, but part of a coordinated sequence, the second phase was already in motion. Meanwhile, Washington continued to operate on a familiar assumption that sustained pressure would eventually produce a predictable reaction. The strategy didn't change. Apply more tariffs, increase restrictions, escalate public messaging, and wait for the other side to adjust. That had worked in previous disputes. But this time, the expected adjustment never came. Instead, financial distortion started deepening. Credit spreads between American and Canadian institutions began to widen in ways that couldn't be explained by fundamentals alone. Energy-linked derivatives showed unusual hedging behavior. Cross-border capital flows, which normally remained stable even during political tension, started shifting through less direct channels. None of this was being explained through official communication, which made interpretation even harder. And in financial systems, Uncertainty grows fastest when data moves faster than explanation. Behind the scenes, Canadian institutions were already aligning not through public announcements or political statements, but through internal positioning. Large pension funds, regulated capital pools, and state-linked financial actors began making coordinated adjustments. Individually, each move looked minor, but together they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. At first, many on Wall Street assumed it was noise, temporary repositioning driven by global uncertainty. They expected it to fade once Washington clarified its next step. Instead, Washington escalated again. And that escalation exposed a critical misread: the assumption that Canada would continue responding inside the same predictable framework. It didn't. Instead of matching pressure with pressure in a visible way, Canada's response was operating through structure, through financial alignment, rather than political reaction. And that difference is what most early analysis missed, because what was unfolding wasn't a reaction cycle anymore. It was a system adjusting itself. The real shift became visible when the pattern stopped looking like scattered reactions and started looking like coordinated movement across the entire system. In fixed income markets, pressure wasn't limited to isolated bonds anymore. It began influencing expectations across the full yield curve. In equity markets, entire sectors began rotating in ways that normally require a clear macro trigger. Yet no single headline could explain the move. Currency traders, instead of relying on official statements, started positioning based on where they believed long-term capital flows were actually heading. And underneath all of it was the same defining feature: synchronized movement without synchronized explanation. Inside Canada's financial system, what had been quietly building was now operating at full alignment. It wasn't one dramatic intervention or a single large transaction. It was a distributed structure, multiple institutions adjusting in different ways, but all moving in the same direction. That's the part most analysts missed early on. They were still looking for individual actions, one major policy move, one big announcement, one clear retaliation. But what they were actually seeing was something broader: a shift in system behavior itself. And once a system changes behavior, it doesn't respond like a collection of separate parts anymore. It starts acting like a single coordinated mechanism. Washington, however, continued interpreting everything through the old framework. The assumption was still that pressure would eventually force a return to normal negotiation dynamics, that Canada would re-enter the familiar cycle of escalation, talks, compromise, and stabilization. But Canada wasn't returning to that cycle. It was moving around it. And that distinction slowly began to show up in institutional analysis. Research desks across major financial firms started revising their models because the standard assumption, symmetrical response under pressure, no longer matched what the data was showing. Instead of reacting through political channels alone, Canada appeared to be operating through financial architecture, adjusting exposure, timing, and capital flows in ways that didn't require visible policy announcements to be effective. Washington kept escalating through the tools it understood best: tariffs, statements, and pressure tactics. But the system it was targeting was no longer responding on the same level. And that's where the gap began to widen, because in that gap between expectation and reality, markets don't wait, they reprick. What was actually unfolding was never a set of disconnected reactions. It was the activation of a system that had already been prepared in advance. And as that realization began spreading through major financial institutions on Wall Street, the entire conflict started to look less like a sequence of political decisions and more like a structured process that had been building long before the latest escalation. From that point of view, Washington's latest move no longer looked like the central event. Instead, it looked like the trigger that revealed a framework already in motion underneath the surface. By the final stage, the line between politics and finance had become increasingly blurred. Every political statement from Washington was quickly reflected in market positioning, and every movement in the markets reshaped how the political situation was being interpreted. The two systems were no longer separate. They were feeding into each other in real time. Yet, Washington continued to speak in familiar terms. The assumption remained that sustained pressure would eventually bring Canada back into a traditional negotiation cycle where concessions and compromises would restore balance. But the financial system had already moved past that assumption. Markets were no longer reacting to individual announcements. They were responding to a deeper structure, one that appeared to have been designed to operate regardless of political messaging. And that's where interpretation began to shift, because analysts were no longer just asking what Canada would do next. They were asking something more fundamental: whether the structure itself had already been in place long before Washington's escalation even began. If that was true, then nothing being seen in real time was improvised. It was simply the unfolding of something already set in motion. And by the time that possibility was fully understood, the nature of the entire conflict had changed. It was no longer about who was applying pressure faster. It was about who had already positioned the system before the pressure ever started. And that question, once it emerged, changed everything that came after.